The morning started like any other in the great halls of the Galactic Council. Ambassador Zethkar of the Vraxian Empire entered the chamber with his usual confident stride, his blue-scaled skin gleaming under the artificial lights. He carried data tablets filled with trade reports and diplomatic notes, ready for another day of routine galactic business. The massive chamber buzzed with the voices of representatives from 47 different worlds, each speaking in their native tongues before the universal translators converted their words into common galactic speech. Zethkar took his place at the curved table that formed a perfect circle in the center of the room. He looked around, noting the familiar faces of his colleagues. The tall, thin Altarians with their silver skin stood near the eastern wall, discussing grain shipments from the outer colonies. The short, stocky Centaurians argued about mining rights in their usual loud voices. Everything seemed normal until Zethkar noticed something strange. The human section was empty. Jake Morrison always sat in seat 47, representing Earth and her colonies. The young human diplomat had never missed a session in 3 years. His chair sat vacant, and his usual morning coffee cup was nowhere to be seen. Zethkar frowned and looked around for other human representatives. Lisa Hayes should have been at the military briefing table, ready to give her weekly patrol reports. The female human captain was known for her punctuality and her detailed knowledge of the Outer Rim territories. Her seat was also empty. Dr. Ben Carter always arrived early to set up his scientific equipment for the daily research presentations. The human scientist's station remained untouched, with dust already beginning to settle on the unused displays. Zethkar activated his communication device and sent a message to the human diplomatic quarters. No response came back. He tried again, this time sending an urgent priority signal. Still nothing. A cold feeling began to grow in his stomach as he realized that something was very wrong. Other council members began to notice the absence as well. The Zephyrian High Counselor Meshtai raised her forearms in a gesture of confusion. Her large black eyes scanned the chamber, looking for any sign of human presence. She had worked closely with human representatives for over a century and had never seen them miss an important session without prior notice. Admiral Crixon of the Centauri Alliance stood up from his chair, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table. He had served in joint military operations with human forces for decades and knew their habits well. Humans were always early, always prepared, and always ready to contribute to discussions. Their sudden absence made no sense. The Council's communication officer, a small green-skinned being from the Rigel system, began checking all available channels. He sent messages to every known human facility, ship, and colony across the galaxy. One by one, the responses came back negative. No human installations were responding to any form of contact. News began to pour in from across the galaxy. The human research station on the edge of the Andromeda Gateway had gone dark overnight. 500 researchers and their families had simply vanished, leaving behind empty rooms and cold equipment. Personal belongings were gone. But the facility itself remained intact and functional. Captain Rodriguez of the trade vessel Morning Star reported that all human cargo ships had disappeared from the main shipping lanes between Earth and Alpha Centauri. Ships that had been tracked just hours before were now nowhere to be found on any scanner or communication network. The mining colony on Kepler 442b sent word that their human technical advisors had vanished from their quarters. The miners had gone to wake them for the morning shift, only to find empty beds and no trace of where they had gone. Their mining equipment continued to operate, but the complex systems that only the humans understood would soon begin to fail without proper maintenance. Reports continued to flood in throughout the day. Human diplomatic missions on 17 different worlds had evacuated overnight without any advance warning. Human military units stationed across the galaxy had withdrawn from their posts, leaving behind only empty barracks and unanswered questions. The most disturbing report came from the Outer Rim defense stations. Commander Pete Walsh and his entire squadron of human pilots had abandoned their posts along the frontier. These were the soldiers who stood guard against unknown threats from beyond the galaxy's edge. For them to leave without explanation suggested Something far more serious than a simple diplomatic withdrawal. Dr. Amy Foster's medical research facility on New Geneva stood empty, her groundbreaking work on interspecies diseases left unfinished. Patients from 12 different worlds had been depending on her research to find cures for conditions that their own medical systems could not treat. As the day wore on, the scope of the disappearance became clear. Every human being in known space had vanished simultaneously. No distress calls had been sent, no emergency beacons had been activated, and no farewell messages had been left behind. It was as if humanity had simply decided to stop existing in the galaxy overnight. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session that evening. Representatives from all member worlds gathered in the great chamber, their voices filled with confusion and concern. Some spoke of possible alien abductions, others suggested a coordinated terrorist attack, but none could explain how an entire species could disappear so completely and so quietly. High Counselor Meshtai called for order as the discussions grew. Heated, her voice carried across the chamber as she addressed the assembled delegates. The humans had been part of the galactic community for over 2 centuries, she reminded them. They had contributed to countless projects, participated in trade agreements, and served in joint military operations. Their sudden departure left gaps in every aspect of galactic society. As the council members debated possible explanations, one fact became increasingly clear. Humanity had not been taken against their will. They had chosen to leave, and they had done so without saying goodbye. The question that haunted every representative in that chamber was simple. Why would an entire species abandon the galaxy that had been their home for so long? The answer to that question would prove to be more disturbing than any of them could imagine. 3 months had passed since humanity vanished from the galaxy, and still no one had any answers. Admiral Crixon stood in the center of the newly formed investigation committee's headquarters, staring at holographic displays that showed the locations of every abandoned human facility. The Centauri military officer had volunteered to lead the search for answers, partly out of curiosity and partly out of growing concern about what the humans' absence might mean for galactic security. The committee included representatives from 12 different species, each bringing their own expertise to the investigation. Dr. Vexani from the Altarian Federation served as the chief scientist, her silver skin gleaming as she worked at multiple computer terminals simultaneously. Commander Thok of the Rigel Defense Corps handled military analysis, while Ambassador Yulter from the Zephyrian Collective managed diplomatic inquiries. Their first major discovery came from examining the abandoned human security offices on the trade station orbiting Proxima Centauri. Detective Sam Rodriguez had been the chief investigator for interspecies crimes in that sector, and his files contained detailed records of cases that had baffled other species for years. The investigation team was shocked to find that Rodriguez had solved complex criminal cases that their best investigators had given up on. One file described a theft ring that had been stealing rare metals from Vraxian mining operations for over 5 years. The Vraxian authorities had spent millions of credits trying to catch the criminals, but their traditional investigative methods had failed completely. Rodriguez had cracked the case in just 3 weeks using techniques that none of the other species had even considered. He had tracked the criminals by analyzing their spending patterns and social connections rather than focusing on the actual thefts. Dr. Vexani studied Rodriguez's methods with growing amazement. The human detective had combined psychological analysis with financial tracking and social network mapping to create investigative techniques that were completely unknown to galactic law enforcement. His success rate was nearly perfect, and his methods had been quietly adopted by security forces across 17 different worlds. The team's next major discovery came from the abandoned engineering facility on the moon of Titan. Pete Collins had been working on terraforming projects that every other species had declared impossible. His workshop contained blueprints for atmospheric processors that could transform dead worlds into living planets in just 50 years instead of the usual 500. Commander Thok examined Collins' designs with disbelief. The human engineer had solved problems that the Galactic Engineering Guild had been working on for centuries. His atmospheric processors used a combination of biological and mechanical systems that no other species had thought to combine. The designs were so advanced that most of the committee members could barely understand how they were supposed to work. More disturbing was the discovery that Collins had been quietly terraforming worlds throughout the galaxy using his revolutionary techniques. 15 different planets that were now home to millions of colonists had been made habitable through Collins' work. Without his ongoing supervision, several of these worlds would begin to revert to their original uninhabitable states within the next few years. The investigation team visited Earth's former agricultural colonies, where they found facilities that had been feeding half the galaxy's population. Rancher Joe Walsh had developed farming techniques that produced 3 times more food than traditional methods while using half the resources. His automated farms were still operating, but without human oversight, they would begin to fail as soon as the equipment needed maintenance. On New Montana, Walsh had transformed a desert planet into the galaxy's largest food producer. His techniques combined genetic engineering with environmental manipulation to create crops that could grow in almost any conditions. The colony still produced enough food to feed 12 billion beings across 40 different worlds, but the complex systems that maintained this production were beginning to show signs of strain without their human caretakers. The most disturbing discovery came from the medical research facility on Kepler 442b. Dr. Amy Foster had been working on cures for diseases that the Galactic Health Organization had declared incurable. Her research covered 7 different species-specific conditions, including the Vraxian scale rot that had been killing thousands every year and the Alterian neural syndrome that left victims paralyzed. Dr. Vexani spent weeks studying Foster's research notes. The human doctor had approached these diseases from angles that no other medical researcher had considered. Instead of treating symptoms, she had focused on the underlying genetic causes and had developed treatments that actually repaired damaged DNA. Her research was 90% complete, but the final breakthrough sequences were missing from all computer records. The investigation revealed that Foster had been providing medical advice to hospitals across the galaxy for over a decade. Her techniques had saved millions of lives and had revolutionized treatment for dozens of previously incurable conditions. Without her ongoing research, many species would soon face medical crises that their own doctors were not equipped to handle. As the investigation continued, a pattern began to emerge. Humans had not just been participants in galactic society. They had been solving problems that other species could not solve, developing technologies that other species could not develop, and providing services that other species could not provide. Their methods were often unconventional and sometimes seemed almost magical to the other council members. Admiral Crixon called a meeting with the full investigation committee to discuss their findings. The conference room fell silent as he presented their conclusions. Humanity had been quietly holding galactic civilization together through their unique abilities and innovative approaches to complex problems. Their departure had left gaps in every sector of galactic society that no other species seemed capable of filling. Commander Thok raised a disturbing question that had been bothering him for weeks. If humans were so valuable to galactic society, why had they chosen to leave? What had driven an entire species to abandon the galaxy that had been their home for over 2 centuries? The answer to that question would require the investigation team to examine not just what humans had been doing, but how other species had been treating them. That examination would reveal uncomfortable truths that many council members would prefer to ignore. Dr. Vexani accessed the diplomatic records from the past 50 years, searching for clues about human relations with other species. What she found would shake the foundations of the Galactic Council and force every member species to confront their own prejudices and assumptions about their human neighbors. The humans had not left because they were unhappy with galactic society. They had left because galactic society had been unhappy with them. 6 months after humanity's departure, the first supply shortages began to appear across the galaxy. High Counselor Meshtai stood in her office overlooking the capital city of Zephyria Prime, watching long lines of citizens waiting for food distributions that should have been routine deliveries. The elegant spires of her homeworld stretched toward the purple sky, but for the first time in her long life, she felt genuine concern about her people's future. The problems had started small. A delayed shipment here, a missing cargo transport. There, the galactic trade networks that had operated smoothly for centuries were beginning to show signs of strain. What the investigation committee had initially dismissed as temporary disruptions were revealing themselves to be fundamental breakdowns in the systems that kept civilization functioning. Rick Stone had been a human merchant captain who operated a fleet of trade vessels throughout the Outer Rim territories. His ships had connected distant worlds that other traders considered too risky or unprofitable to serve. Without Stone's transport network, several colonies were facing shortages of essential medical supplies and industrial equipment that they could not produce locally. The Rigel Mining Consortium reported that their operations on 7 different asteroids had been forced to shut down because they could no longer receive the specialized drilling equipment that only Stone's company had been willing to transport to such remote locations. Thousands of miners were now unemployed, and the rare metals they had been extracting were no longer available to manufacturers across the galaxy. Dr. Vexani studied the trade records from Stone's company and discovered something that shocked her. The human merchant had not just been running a profitable business. He had been deliberately serving routes that other species avoided, ensuring that even the most isolated colonies received the supplies they needed to survive. His profit margins on these routes had been minimal, sometimes barely covering fuel costs. The investigation revealed that Stone had been coordinating with dozens of other human traders to create supply chains that connected every inhabited world in the galaxy. They had divided territories not based on profit potential, but based on need. Worlds that could not afford premium shipping rates had been served by human companies at cost, subsidized by profits from more lucrative routes. Without this hidden network of human traders, the galactic economy was beginning to fragment. Wealthy core worlds continued to receive regular shipments, but frontier colonies and developing worlds were being cut off from essential supplies. Several planets had already declared states of emergency as their stockpiles of food and medicine began to run low. The military situation was even worse. Colonel Kate Murphy had been a human strategic advisor who worked with 17 different planetary defense forces. Her tactical innovations had prevented 3 separate wars through careful deployment of troops and diplomatic pressure. Without her guidance, old territorial disputes that had been dormant for decades were beginning to flare up again. The Vraxian Empire and the Altarian Federation had been engaged in a border dispute over the Kepler system for over a century. Murphy had designed a patrol schedule that kept both sides' military forces separated while allowing them to maintain their territorial claims. Her system had worked so well that most beings had forgotten there was ever a conflict in that region. Now, without Murphy's careful coordination, both sides were increasing their military presence in the disputed area. Vrexian battle cruisers were conducting aggressive patrol patterns that brought them dangerously close to Altarian vessels. The Altarian Federation had responded by deploying their newest warships to the region, escalating tensions to levels not seen in 50 years. Admiral Crixon tried to mediate between the two sides using traditional diplomatic methods, but he quickly discovered that Murphy's approach had been far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. She had not just separated the opposing forces. She had created a complex system of joint training exercises and cooperative missions that had gradually built trust between former enemies. Murphy's files revealed that she had been organizing secret meetings between Vraxian and Altarian military officers, allowing them to work together on common problems while maintaining the fiction that they were still rivals. Her psychological understanding of both species had enabled her to design scenarios where cooperation was more beneficial than conflict. Without Murphy's guidance, the old suspicions between the two species were returning. Both sides were beginning to view the other's military movements as aggressive preparations for war rather than routine defensive measures. The situation was deteriorating rapidly toward actual combat. The diplomatic crisis was spreading beyond just the Vexan-Altarian dispute. Throughout the galaxy, human diplomats had been quietly mediating conflicts that other species barely knew existed. Henry Park had been working with the governments of 12 different worlds to resolve trade disputes, territorial claims, and cultural conflicts that could have led to serious wars. Park's negotiation techniques had been studied by xenopsychologists for years, but none of them had been able to replicate his success rate. The human diplomat seemed to have an intuitive understanding of how different species thought and what motivated their behavior. His solutions to complex problems often seemed obvious in retrospect, but no other negotiator had been able to predict them in advance. The most critical discovery came from examining the galactic communication network. Tony Chun had been a human engineer who worked on the quantum relay systems that enabled instantaneous communication across the galaxy. The investigation team had assumed that his work was routine maintenance, but they discovered that Chun had been making subtle modifications to the network for over 20 years. The human engineer had redesigned the relay algorithms to handle increasing traffic loads and had developed backup systems that prevented network failures during solar storms and cosmic interference events. His modifications had increased the network's efficiency by 300% while reducing power consumption by half. Without Chun's ongoing maintenance, the communication network was beginning to experience cascading failures. Messages between distant worlds were being delayed or lost entirely. The quantum relays that connected the outer rim colonies to the galactic core were operating at reduced capacity, and several had already gone offline completely. Dr. Vexani realized with growing horror that the network would collapse entirely within the next 6 months if the failures continued at their current rate. Without galactic communications, the Council would lose contact with half the member worlds, and the carefully coordinated systems that kept civilization functioning would break down completely. The investigation committee presented their findings to the full Galactic Council in an emergency session. The chamber that had once buzzed with confident discussions of galactic policy now filled with worried voices as representatives began to understand the scope of their dependence on human contributions. High Counselor Meshtai stood at the center of the chamber, her forearms trembling as she addressed the assembled delegates. The humans had not just been another member species participating in galactic affairs. They had been the invisible foundation that supported every aspect of interspecies cooperation and trade for 2 centuries. The other species had assumed that galactic civilization was the natural result of their own wisdom and cooperation. They had viewed human contributions as helpful but not essential. Now they were learning that without human innovation, human logistics, and human diplomacy, their entire way of life would collapse within a matter of years. The most terrifying realization was still to come. As the council members debated emergency measures to address the growing crises, long-range sensors were detecting something approaching from beyond the galaxy's edge that would make all their current problems seem insignificant. 8 months after humanity's departure, the Deep Space Monitoring Station at the edge of the galaxy detected something that made every previous crisis seem like a minor inconvenience. Commander Yextal of the Outer Rim Defense Corps stared at his sensor displays with growing dread as massive shapes moved through the void between galaxies. Approaching at speeds that should have been impossible, the void swarm had been detected before, but most council members had dismissed it as a distant threat that would not reach their galaxy for thousands of years. The dark entities that consumed entire star systems were moving faster than any previous calculations had predicted, and they would reach the Outer Rim territories within 6 months. Admiral Crixon rushed to the monitoring station as soon as he received Phil's urgent transmission. The massive Centauri officer had seen many threats during his long military career, but nothing had prepared him for the sensor readings that showed creatures the size of planets moving through space with purpose and intelligence. The investigation committee was called into emergency session to search through human records for any information about the approaching threat. What they discovered in the abandoned human research facilities made their blood run cold. Dr. Roy Martinez had been tracking the Void Swarm for over 3 years, and his files contained detailed analysis of the creature's capabilities and behavior. Patterns. Martinez had tried to warn the Galactic Council about the approaching threat on 17 different occasions, but his reports had been filed away and ignored. The other species had dismissed his warnings as typical human paranoia about distant dangers that might never materialize. They had been far more concerned with immediate problems like trade disputes and territorial claims. The human scientists. Research revealed that the Void Swarm was not just a collection of mindless creatures. They were an intelligent species that had consumed dozens of galaxies throughout the universe, growing stronger and more organized with each conquest. Their technology was based on biological systems that could adapt to any defense and regenerate from almost any damage. Dr. Visani studied Martinez's files with increasing horror. The human researcher had identified the swarm's methods of attack and had been developing countermeasures that might have stopped them. His work was based on understanding the creatures' biological weaknesses and exploiting their dependence on certain types of energy sources. The most disturbing discovery was that Martinez had not been working alone. General Alex Turner had been coordinating with him to develop military strategies for defending against the swarm's inevitable arrival. Turner's battle plans were found in abandoned human command centers, outlining defensive positions and tactical approaches that no other species had considered. Turner had been quietly preparing human military units for a war that other species refused to acknowledge was coming. His soldiers had been conducting training exercises in the outer territories that other species had assumed were routine military drills. In reality, they had been practicing specific tactics designed to combat an enemy that could regenerate from damage and adapt to conventional weapons. The human general's files contained detailed analysis of every major battle the swarm had fought in other galaxies. He had studied their attack patterns and had identified weaknesses that could be exploited with proper preparation and coordination. His strategies required precise timing and the kind of aggressive tactics that other species had always criticized. Humans for employing. Commander Thok examined Turner's battle plans and realized that the human military officer had been preparing for a type of warfare that was completely foreign to galactic military doctrine. The other species had spent centuries developing weapons and tactics designed to fight other intelligent beings who followed logical patterns of behavior. The Void Swarm followed no such patterns. Turner's strategies involved hit-and-run attacks, guerrilla warfare, and the deliberate sacrifice of territory to draw the enemy into prepared killing zones. These were concepts that most galactic military officers found distasteful and dishonorable. The human approach to warfare emphasized results over honor, effectiveness over elegance. The investigation team discovered that pilot Sarah Kim had been leading a squadron of human fighters in training exercises that other species had viewed with suspicion. Her pilots had been practicing maneuvers that seemed reckless and dangerous by normal standards, flying their ships in ways that pushed both man and machine to their absolute limits. Kim's training records revealed that she had been preparing her squadron to fight an enemy that could not be defeated through conventional space combat. Her pilots had been learning to use their ships as weapons, conducting suicide attacks and ramming maneuvers that would destroy both attacker and target. It was a brutal approach to warfare that other species found barbaric. The most critical discovery came from the abandoned human armories scattered throughout the galaxy. Weapons engineer Don Foster had been developing a new class of weapons specifically designed to combat the swarm's regenerative abilities. His prototypes used quantum disruption, technology that could prevent biological tissue from regenerating after damage. Foster's weapons were unlike anything in the galactic arsenal. They were designed to cause permanent damage to biological systems, preventing the rapid healing that made the Void Swarm so dangerous. The weapons were crude and brutal by galactic standards, but they were also the only technology that had proven effective against similar creatures in other galaxies. The problem was that Foster's weapons required specific manufacturing techniques that only human engineers understood. The prototypes found in human facilities could not be reproduced without the detailed manufacturing codes that Foster had taken with him when humanity departed. The weapons existed, but no other species knew how to make more of them. Dr. Vexani realized that humanity had been preparing for a war that the rest of the galaxy had refused to acknowledge. While other species had been focused on trade agreements and diplomatic protocols, humans had been quietly studying an existential threat and developing the tools needed to survive it. The Void Swarm reached the first inhabited system in the Outer Rim just as the investigation committee finished reviewing the human files. The creatures consumed 3 planets and their populations in less than a day, their massive forms literally devouring matter and energy to fuel their continued expansion. Admiral Crixon watched the destruction from the bridge of his flagship, knowing that every conventional weapon in the galactic arsenal would be useless against an enemy that could regenerate from any damage. The combined fleets of 17 different species moved to intercept the swarm, but their tactics were based on fighting other intelligent beings, not creatures that existed only to consume and destroy. The first engagement was a disaster. Galactic forces used traditional battle formations and conventional weapons against an enemy that ignored all accepted rules of warfare. The Void Swarm creatures absorbed energy weapon fire and used it to fuel their own growth, while their biological weapons dissolved ship hulls and turned the materials into more swarm entities. Within hours, half the defending fleet had been destroyed or consumed. The survivors retreated in panic, sending desperate messages back to the galactic core warning that their most powerful weapons were not just ineffective but were actually making the enemy stronger. High Counselor Meshtai received the battle reports in her office on Zephyria Prime, her forearms shaking as she realized that the galaxy faced an enemy that their entire civilization was unprepared to fight. The humans had tried to warn them, had tried to prepare them, and had been ignored and dismissed as warmongers and paranoids. Now the Void Swarm was advancing toward the core systems, consuming everything in their path, and the galaxy's greatest defenders were nowhere to be found. The species that had been their shield against existential threats had been driven away by the very beings they had been trying to protect. As the swarm continued its inexorable advance, the Galactic Council finally understood what they had lost when humanity departed without speaking. The Void Swarm consumed the Rigel system in 3 days, turning 5 inhabited worlds into empty space filled only with the dark matter that the creatures used to fuel their expansion. Admiral Crixon stood in the command center of the last major defensive station, watching sensor displays that showed more than 50 swarm entities approaching the Centauri home system. Each creature was the size of a small moon, and their biological weapons could dissolve any known material in seconds. The combined fleets of the Galactic Council had tried every weapon in their arsenal against the advancing swarm. Energy weapons fed the creatures and made them stronger. Kinetic weapons were absorbed and converted into more swarm biomass. Nuclear weapons simply provided more energy for the entities to consume. Nothing in 2 centuries of galactic military development could even slow their advance. High Counselor Meshtai had evacuated her homeworld 3 days earlier, watching from her command ship as Zephyria Prime was consumed by creatures that turned her beautiful cities into raw material for their continued growth. Her forearms hung limp at her sides as she realized that her ancient civilization, which had survived for over 10,000 years, would be extinct within the week. The investigation committee had gathered aboard Admiral Crixon's flagship, still searching through human records for any clue that might help them survive the approaching apocalypse. Dr. Vexani worked frantically at multiple computer terminals, analyzing every piece of data that humanity had left behind about the Void Swarm and their methods of attack. Commander Thok stood guard at the entrance to the data center, his weapons ready, even though he knew that no conventional force could protect them from what was coming. The proud Rigel warrior had spent his entire life preparing for combat, but the enemy approaching them could not be fought with honor or courage. They were a force of nature that consumed everything in their path. It was Dr. Vexani who found the final message that humanity had left behind. Hidden in the deepest archives of the abandoned human facility on Luna, she discovered a single file that had been sealed with encryption codes that took her 3 days to break. The message was dated the day before humanity's departure, and it was addressed to the Galactic Council from Commander Bruce Wayne of the Human Military Liaison Office. The message began with a simple statement that made every member of the investigation committee feel sick with guilt and regret. Wayne explained that humanity had tried for decades to warn the other species about threats that existed beyond the galaxy's borders, but their warnings had been dismissed as paranoid fantasies and warmongering propaganda. Wayne's message detailed how human scientists had been tracking extragalactic threats for over 50 years, identifying patterns of galactic destruction that indicated the presence of species like the Void Swarm. Every time they had tried to share this information with the Galactic Council, they had been told that their research was unnecessary, and that their focus on military preparation was disturbing to other species. The human commander explained how his people had been quietly preparing defenses against threats that other species refused to acknowledge. They had developed weapons, tactics, and strategies specifically designed to fight enemies that could not be defeated through conventional warfare. Their methods had been criticized as brutal and uncivilized by species who preferred elegant solutions to complex problems. Wayne described how human diplomats had tried to organize joint military exercises to prepare for extragalactic threats, only to be told that such preparations were provocative and dangerous to galactic peace. Human military advisors had been removed from planning committees because their tactical recommendations were considered too aggressive for civilized warfare. The message revealed that humanity had been providing protection for the galaxy without the other species even realizing it. Human patrol ships had been stationed at the edges of known space, watching for signs of approaching threats and ready to provide early warning to the galactic core. Human research stations had been monitoring cosmic phenomena that could indicate the presence of hostile forces from other galaxies. Most painfully, Wayne explained that humanity had developed the weapons and strategies needed to fight the Void Swarm, but they had been forbidden from deploying them by Galactic Council regulations that restricted the development of what other species considered to be unnecessarily destructive technology. The very weapons that could have saved the galaxy had been banned as violations of civilized warfare protocols. Wayne's message concluded with words that would haunt every survivor of the galactic catastrophe. He explained that humanity had not abandoned the galaxy out of anger or spite, but out of respect for the other species' stated wishes. The Council had made it clear through decades of regulations and restrictions that human methods of protection were unwelcome and unwanted. The humans had chosen to leave rather than impose their protection on species who did not want it. They had taken their weapons, their strategies, and their willingness to fight brutal enemies to some other part of the universe where their methods might be appreciated. They had left the galaxy to find its own path to survival, just as the Council had always insisted it should. Dr. Vexani played the final part of Wayne's message to the assembled investigation committee, her silver skin pale with shock as the human's words echoed through the command center. Wayne had concluded his farewell by expressing hope that the other species would find ways to defend themselves that were more compatible with their civilized values and elegant philosophies. The investigation team sat in stunned silence as they realized what they had done. They had driven away the galaxy's protectors because they disapproved of the methods those protectors used. They had prioritized their comfort and moral sensibilities over their actual survival, and now they were paying the ultimate price for that choice. Admiral Crixon activated the emergency broadcast system, sending Wayne's message to every surviving ship and station in the galaxy. As the humans' words spread throughout the remaining population, species after species began to understand that they had brought their destruction upon themselves through their own arrogance and prejudice. The Void Swarm reached the core systems as the broadcast was concluding. The creatures consumed world after world, turning the greatest civilizations in galactic history into raw material for their continued expansion. The elegant cities and beautiful monuments that had taken millennia to construct were devoured in hours by entities that recognized no value in art, culture, or philosophy. Admiral Crixon stood on the bridge of his flagship as the swarm approached Centauri Prime, watching the planet where he had been born disappear into the dark mass of the advancing creatures. His final transmission was sent into the void of space, hoping against hope that somewhere in the universe humanity might receive his message. The transmission was simple and heartfelt. Crixon admitted that the Galactic Council had been wrong about humanity, wrong about the threats that existed beyond their borders, and wrong about the methods needed to survive in a dangerous universe. He apologized for the arrogance and prejudice that had driven humanity away, and he begged them to forgive the galaxy for its blindness. The message ended with a plea that would echo through empty space, long after the last galactic civilization had been consumed. Crixon asked humanity to remember the galaxy not for its final failures, but for the brief time when different species had worked together toward common goals. He hoped that wherever humanity had gone, they would build something better than what had been lost. The void swarm consumed the last inhabited world 3 days later. The galaxy that had once been home to trillions of beings from dozens of different species became a dark wasteland filled only with the slowly expanding mass of the creatures that had devoured everything in their path. In the silence that followed, only one truth remained clear. The galaxy had not been destroyed by the void swarm, it had been destroyed by the arrogance of species, who thought they knew better than the beings who had been trying to protect them. Fear was not something that humanity had brought to the galaxy through their aggressive methods and brutal weapons. Fear was what the galaxy should have felt when they realized they were driving away the only species capable of defending them from the darkness that existed beyond the stars. The other species had spent centuries viewing humans as young and impulsive, requiring guidance and restraint from their more civilized neighbors. They had seen human military preparations as unnecessarily aggressive and human warnings about distant threats as paranoid delusions. They had believed that their own wisdom and cooperation were sufficient to handle any challenge that might arise. Now, as the last echoes of galactic civilization faded into cosmic silence, the truth was finally clear. Humanity had not been the students in need of teaching. They had been the teachers whose lessons had been ignored. They had not been the protected in need of guidance. They had been the protectors whose service had been rejected. The galaxy had chosen elegance over effectiveness, honor over survival, and comfort over security. They had valued their moral superiority over their continued existence, and they had paid the ultimate price for that choice. The void swarm had not conquered the galaxy through superior force or advanced technology.